I'll be home late tonight. Don't wait up, Carlos said, his voice steady as he leaned against the kitchen counter. He watched Erica, his wife, barely glance up from her phone. She nodded, but her eyes remained glued to the screen, fingers tapping away. Carlos's stomach tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Did you hear me?" he asked, injecting a bit more force into his tone. Erica blinked, finally looking up as if startled by his presence. "Yeah, I heard you," she replied, her voice distant. "Late night at work?" Carlos nodded, though he noticed how quickly she returned to her phone. "Yeah, I got a lot to catch up on." He waited, hoping for a follow-up question, something to show that she cared, but nothing came. He watched her for a moment longer, taking in the subtle changes he'd been noticing for months now. The way she angled her phone screen away from him, the quick flicker of her eyes when he walked into a room, the hushed tones when she answered certain calls. Each sign was small, almost imperceptible on its own, but together they painted a picture he couldn't ignore. "Anything special planned tonight?" he asked, keeping his tone light, as if he were just making casual conversation. Erica looked up again, her expression blank for a moment before she forced a smile. "No, just the usual. Maybe a movie and an early night." Carlos nodded, suppressing the urge to confront her right then and there. "Sounds good," he said, pushing himself off the counter. "I'll see you tomorrow, then." He walked over and kissed her on the cheek, a gesture that once had been full of warmth and affection. Now it felt like an act, a hollow motion. She stiffened slightly under his touch, a reaction that sent a surge of anger through him. He pulled back, studying her face, but she had already turned back to her phone, dismissing him from her mind as easily as one might swat away a fly. Without another word, Carlos grabbed his keys and headed for the door. As he stepped outside, the cool evening air hit him, clearing his head. He paused on the porch, his hand on the doorknob, and took a deep breath. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, it all swirled inside him like a tornado, but he forced himself to remain calm. Tonight, everything would change. Sliding into his car, he started the engine, the hum of the motor soothing his frayed nerves. He drove down the quiet streets, his mind racing with the plans he had been carefully laying out for weeks. Each detail had been scrutinized, each step meticulously planned. There would be no room for mistakes. As he drove, his phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He picked it up, glancing at the screen. A text from Erica. "Drive safe. See you tomorrow." Carlos stared at the message, his fingers tightening around the phone. It was such a simple text, so ordinary, yet it felt like a knife twisting in his gut. He tossed the phone back onto the seat and gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. He knew Erica wasn't just passing the time with movies and early nights. He knew there was someone else, someone who had wormed their way into her life, into her heart. The thought made him sick, but he swallowed down the bile rising in his throat. He needed to stay focused. His car merged onto the freeway, the city lights blurring as he picked up speed. The drive to his office was familiar, the same route he'd taken for years, but tonight it felt different, charged with an energy that set his nerves on edge. He kept running through the events of the last few months in his head, piecing together every clue, every suspicious moment. He remembered the first time he'd noticed the change in Erica. It had been subtle, a new dress she'd bought, a perfume he'd never smelled on her before. At first, he hadn't thought much of it, but then there were the nights she started coming home later, the sudden need for privacy, the phone she always kept face down on the table. The suspicions had gnawed at him, but he'd tried to dismiss them, telling himself he was being paranoid. But then he'd found the text messages. He hadn't meant to snoop, but her phone had buzzed while she was in the shower, and the name on the screen had caught his eye. Harris. The message had been innocuous enough, but something about it didn't sit right. That was when he'd hired the private investigator Jeff. Jeff had been thorough, sending him reports and photos that confirmed his worst fears. Erica was having an affair. The evidence was damning. But Carlos had waited, biding his time, letting the anger build until he was ready to act. And now, tonight, everything was in place. His plan was set in motion, and there was no turning back. As he pulled into the parking garage beneath his office building, Carlos parked in his usual spot and sat for a moment, the weight of what he was about to do settling on his shoulders. He took another deep breath, pushing away the doubts that tried to creep in. He wasn't just doing this for himself. He was doing it for the years he'd invested in his marriage, for the trust he'd placed in Erica, and for the man he used to be before betrayal had hardened his heart. Carlos exited the car, his footsteps echoing through the empty garage as he made his way to the elevator. He rode up to his floor, the elevator's hum matching the thrum of blood in his ears. When the doors slid open, Carlos stepped out into his office, the familiar surroundings offering little comfort. Tonight, it was something different. Tonight, it was the command center for his revenge. He didn't bother turning on the lights. The glow from the city outside was enough. He sat at his desk, staring at the blank computer screen. His mind wasn't on work. It hadn't been for days. His hand hovered over the phone. Then he picked it up and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Jeff, it's time," Carlos said when the call connected. His voice was steady, but his heart was pounding. Jeff, the private investigator he'd hired a month ago, was a man of few words. "You sure about this?" Jeff's voice, usually gruff, held a note of concern. He had seen the kind of damage plans like this could do, not just to the targets, but to the people behind them. Carlos didn't hesitate. "I'm sure," he replied, his tone firm. He had spent weeks thinking about this, turning it over in his mind until every detail was perfect. "Meet me at the house at 8 p.m. and bring the crew." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "All right," Jeff said finally, his voice resigned. "See you then." The line went dead. Carlos placed the phone down slowly, leaning back in his chair. His eyes traced the outline of the office, but his mind was far away. He thought about the first time he had met Jeff, a meeting in a dimly lit coffee shop. Jeff had been all business, laying out the plan with the precision of a man who had done this many times before. Carlos had listened, nodding along, every word sinking in like a stone in water. He remembered the first envelope Jeff had handed him. Inside were photos, Erica with another man, laughing, touching, kissing. Carlos had stared at them for what felt like hours, his heart breaking with each passing minute. But then something in him had hardened. The pain turned to anger, and the anger turned to resolve. Carlos got up from his chair and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. The view that once inspired him now felt like a backdrop to a life he no longer recognized. He thought about Erica, the woman he had loved for years, the woman he had trusted with everything. How could she betray him like this? The thought was like a knife twisting in his gut. He turned away from the window, unable to stand the sight any longer. He walked over to a small cabinet in the corner of his office and opened it, revealing a bottle of whiskey. He poured himself a glass, the amber liquid swirling in the dim light. He took a sip, the burn in his throat a welcome distraction from the pain in his chest. The memories flooded back, late nights at the office, Erica calling to say she missed him, the way she would smile when he walked through the door. It all felt like a lie now. He had been blind, so wrapped up in his work, in providing for them, that he hadn't seen what was right in front of him. But now he knew, and there was no going back. He took another sip of whiskey, feeling the warmth spread through his body. His mind wandered to the plan, the setup that had taken weeks to perfect. It was simple, yet devastating. Jeff would be there, along with the camera crew. They would catch everything on tape. Erica, her lover, the betrayal. And then it would go live for the world to see. There would be no escaping it, no denying it. Carlos placed the glass down, the decision final in his mind. He walked back to his desk, sitting down with a heavy sigh. He picked up his phone again, this time scrolling through old messages from Erica. They were full of love, of plans for the future. He wondered how much of it had been real. How long had she been lying to him? How long had he been a fool? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a knock at the door. He looked up, surprised. It was late, and no one should be here. He hesitated, then got up and opened the door. It was Michael, his assistant. "Carlos, you okay?" Michael asked, his voice filled with concern. He had noticed the changes in Carlos over the past few weeks. The late nights, the distracted look in his eyes. Carlos forced a smile, shaking his head. "I'm fine, Michael. Just a lot on my mind." Michael nodded, though he didn't look convinced. "If you need anything, I'm here." Carlos appreciated the offer, but this was something he had to do alone. "Thanks, but I'm good. You should head home. It's late." Michael hesitated, then nodded. "All right. Take care, Carlos. Carlos watched as Michael left, closing the door behind him. The office was silent again, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. He sat back down at his desk, the weight of the night ahead pressing down on him. He picked up the glass of whiskey again, taking another sip as he stared at the clock. Time seemed to move slowly, each minute dragging on as he waited for the hour to arrive. His mind raced, playing out the scenario over and over. He imagined Erica's face when she realized what was happening, the shock, the betrayal. It would hurt, but it was nothing compared to the pain she had caused him. As the clock struck 7:30, Carlos stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. He grabbed his coat and headed for the door. The drive home was short, but it felt like an eternity. His hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He kept thinking about what he was about to do, the finality of it all. When he arrived home, the house was dark, quiet. He parked the car and sat there for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Then he got out, walking up to the front door. He unlocked it and stepped inside, the familiar smell of home filling his senses. But it didn't feel like home anymore. Not after everything. He walked through the house, checking each room. It was empty, just as he had expected. Erica wouldn't be home until later. He made his way to the living room, sitting down on the couch. The clock on the wall ticked louder in the silence, each second bringing him closer to the moment of truth. At exactly 8 p.m., the doorbell rang. Carlos stood up, his heart pounding. He walked to the door and opened it, finding Jeff and the camera crew standing there. Jeff gave him a nod. No words needed. They all knew what was about to happen. "Let's do this," Carlos said, stepping aside to let them in. They entered the house, setting up quickly, efficiently. Carlos watched them, his mind focused on the task at hand. There was no turning back now. Everything was in place, and soon, the truth would be revealed. Erica came home after work. She paced the living room, her nerves on edge. The house was quiet, but her mind was anything but. She replayed the morning in her head, trying to pinpoint what was bothering her. Carlos had seemed different. His usual warmth had been replaced with a cold, calculated calm that made her uneasy. "You're just being paranoid," she muttered, trying to shake off the feeling. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke her thoughts. She rushed to the window, peeking through the curtains. It was Harris. Relief flooded through her as she watched him get out of the car, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She opened the door before he could knock, pulling him inside quickly. "Hey," Harris said, his voice low and warm. He leaned in, brushing his lips against hers. The kiss was quick, almost perfunctory, but it was enough to steady her nerves. For a moment, the unease melted away. "Carlos is working late, right?" Harris asked, already pulling her close as they moved toward the stairs. Erica nodded, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of her mind. "Yes, he'll be at the office until late," she assured him, though she wasn't entirely sure. The knot in her stomach tightened, but she pushed it down. "We have plenty of time." They reached the bedroom, and as soon as the door closed behind them, the outside world seemed to disappear. Harris's hands were on her, his touch familiar and comforting. She let herself get lost in the moment, hoping that the passion would drown out the anxiety that had been building all day. But the reprieve was short-lived. Just as they were about to give in to the moment, a phone rang. The sound cut through the room like a knife, startling them both. "Ignore it," Harris whispered, his voice husky with desire. He kissed her neck, trying to pull her attention back to him. Erica hesitated, wanting to lose herself in the moment, but the ringing persisted. The sound was insistent, demanding her attention. She sighed, pulling away from Harris. "I should check," she said, reaching for her phone on the nightstand. Harris watched her, a frown creasing his brow. "Who is it?" he asked, his tone more serious now. Erica looked at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Carlos's name. "It's him," she whispered, her voice trembling. Harris's eyes widened, and he sat up, his mood instantly shifting from desire to concern. "What does he want?" Erica shook her head, trying to make sense of it. Carlos never called when he was at work, especially not this late. Her fingers fumbled as she swiped to answer the call, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hello," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Carlos's voice on the other end was calm, too calm. "I hope you're ready for a surprise," he said, the words chilling in their simplicity. Erica's blood ran cold. Her mind raced, trying to understand what he meant. "Carlos, what are you?" she started to ask, but the words caught in her throat as a noise outside the bedroom door made her freeze. Before she could react, the bedroom door burst open with a force that made her jump. Carlos stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were cold hard. Behind him, a camera crew filed into the room, their lenses pointed directly at her and Harris. "Carlos!" Erica gasped, pulling the sheet up to cover herself. "What the fuck are you doing?" Her voice was high-pitched, panic lacing every word. Carlos stepped into the room, ignoring her question. He looked at Harris, who was scrambling to gather his clothes, his face pale with fear. "Don't bother, Harris," Carlos said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You won't need them where you're going." Harris froze, his eyes darting between Carlos and the camera crew. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, trying to maintain some semblance of control, but his voice wavered. The camera crew behind him moved with practiced efficiency, setting up lights, adjusting angles, capturing every detail of the scene before them. Carlos didn't immediately respond. He took a step into the room, his gaze sweeping over the disheveled bed, the crumpled sheets, the half-dressed figure of Harris who was still scrambling to find his clothes. Finally, Carlos turned his attention back to Erica, his lips curling into a smirk that sent a chill down her spine. "Smile, you're on live TV," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. The words hit Erica like a slap in the face. Her mind raced, trying to process the horror unfolding around her. This wasn't just a private moment of betrayal. This was a public spectacle. Her legs felt weak, threatening to give out beneath her as the weight of her actions bore down on her. "Carlos, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice a mere whisper now. Harris, who had been frozen in shock, suddenly snapped into action. "This is insane," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He stumbled out of bed, his movements frantic as he grabbed at his clothes, trying to cover himself. But it was too late. The cameras had already captured everything. His nakedness, his fear, his desperate attempt to flee. As Harris struggled to pull on his pants, he glanced toward the window, his only escape route. His heart raced as he bolted for it, nearly tripping over his own feet in his haste. He fumbled with the latch, his hands shaking as he finally managed to open it. Without looking back, he leaped out of the window, crashing through the bushes below and disappearing into the night. The sound of his hurried footsteps fading into the distance was the only indication that he had made his escape. Erica stood there, her body trembling, as the cameras now turned their full attention to her. The bright lights felt like 1,000 eyes, watching her every move, every expression. "Carlos, please," she begged, her voice breaking as tears streamed down her face. "This isn't right. We can talk about this. Just stop, please." Carlos's expression hardened. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. "Talk," he repeated, the word laced with bitterness. "Bitch, we had plenty of time to talk. But instead, you chose to lie, to betray me. And now, everyone will know the truth." The crew moved around them, their cameras capturing every tear, every sob, every moment of Erica's unraveling. She looked at Carlos, searching for any sign of the man she had once loved, the man who had once loved her. But all she saw was cold, unyielding fury. "Carlos, I'm sorry," she cried, her voice desperate. "I never meant for it to go this far. Please don't do this. We can fix this, I swear. Just give me a chance." But Carlos shook his head, his expression unmoved by her pleas. "A chance? You want a chance after everything you've done?" He laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and devoid of any real humor. "No, Erica. The time for chances is over. Now it's time for consequences." Erica felt a wave of despair wash over her as she realized there was no escaping this. The truth of her actions, the pain she had caused, was being laid bare for the world to see. She had never imagined it would come to this, that the man she had once shared her life with would turn on her in such a brutal, public way. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every raw moment of her agony. She could feel the walls closing in on her, her world crumbling as the reality of her situation set in. "Carlos, please," she whispered again, though she knew it was useless. "I'm sorry." Carlos stared at her, his eyes cold and unfeeling. "You're only sorry because you got caught," he said, his voice flat. "But now, everyone will see who you really are. And when this is over, you'll have nothing left." The words cut through her like a knife, each one deepening the wound. She had known Carlos would be hurt, angry even, but she had never imagined he would go to such lengths to destroy her. The man standing before her was a stranger, someone she no longer recognized. The camera crew, seemingly immune to the tension in the room, continued their work, capturing every angle, every tear-streaked moment of Erica's downfall. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like an animal caught in a trap with no way out. "Carlos," she tried once more, her voice weak, "I loved you. I still do. Can't we?" Carlos cut her off, his expression hardening even further. "Love? Don't talk to me about love. You threw that away the moment you decided to sleep with him." He gestured toward the window where Harris had made his escape. "This isn't about love, Erica. It's about justice. And now, you're going to face the consequences of your actions." Erica's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the bed, her sobs racking her body as the reality of her situation became undeniable. There was no going back, no fixing what had been broken. She had lost everything, her dignity, her marriage, her future. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the final, pitiful moments of her breakdown. Carlos watched, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. He had waited for this moment, planned it meticulously, and now that it was here, he felt nothing but a hollow emptiness where his anger had once been. Finally, Carlos turned to the camera crew and gave a curt nod. "We're done here," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. The crew began packing up their equipment, their job complete. Erica remained on the bed, a broken figure, her sobs the only sound in the now quiet room. Carlos walked to the door, pausing for a moment to look back at her. "Goodbye, Erica," he said quietly, and then he was gone, leaving her alone with the ruins of her life. The door closed behind him with a final, echoing click, sealing the end of everything she had once known. The night the footage aired, it spread across the internet with a speed and intensity that Erica could never have anticipated. It was everywhere, on social media, news sites, and even viral video platforms. The clip was shared, reshared, and dissected by people who had never met her, but now felt entitled to pass judgment on every aspect of her life. Erica sat alone in her darkened living room, the curtains drawn tight, as though to shut out the world. Her phone buzzed relentlessly on the coffee table, but she didn't have the courage to pick it up. The notifications piled up, messages from friends, missed calls from family, and comments from strangers who had somehow gotten hold of her number. She knew what they would say. She didn't need to read them to know that her life, as she knew it, was over. The screen flickered as another notification popped up. "You're trending," it read, as if this was some achievement. Erica stared at the phone, numbness settling in where panic had been. She was trending, all right, but for all the wrong reasons. Her betrayal, her moment of weakness, had been laid bare for the entire world to see. She felt her breath catch in her throat as she scrolled through the endless stream of messages. The ones from people she knew were the hardest to read. Her mother had called 6 times, each voicemail more frantic than the last. Her closest friends had sent messages filled with a mix of shock, disappointment, and pity. But the strangers, those were the worst. They were brutal, unfiltered, their words stabbing at her like knives. "Slut. Homewrecker. You deserve everything you got." The insults blended together in a cacophony of hate that was impossible to escape. She buried her face in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. Every tear felt like it was tearing her apart from the inside. The world she had known had collapsed in an instant, and there was no going back. The Erica that people had known, respected, maybe even loved, was gone. In her place was someone she barely recognized, someone defined by a single, terrible mistake. Carlos, meanwhile, sat in his apartment, staring blankly at the TV screen. He had turned off his phone hours ago, unable to bear the barrage of calls and texts. Some were congratulatory, people he hadn't spoken to in years reaching out to tell him how proud they were of what he had done. Others were concerned, questioning whether he was okay, asking if he wanted to talk. But Carlos had no desire to talk. The man who had orchestrated the public humiliation of his wife felt more alone than ever. His reflection in the darkened screen stared back at him, accusing. Was this what he had wanted? In the moment, it had seemed like the perfect plan. Make her pay for what she had done, expose her to the world, show everyone the truth. But now, sitting here in the silence, all he felt was emptiness. The doorbell rang, cutting through the stillness. Carlos didn't move at first, hoping whoever it was would just go away. But the ringing persisted, followed by a knock. Reluctantly, he got up and went to the door. Jeff, he greeted his friend, stepping aside to let him in. Jeff had been his confidant throughout this ordeal, the one person who had helped him pull it all together. But now, as he looked at his friend, Carlos felt a wave of uncertainty wash over him. Jeff walked in, his expression serious. I saw the video, he said, taking a seat on the couch. He glanced around the room, noting the empty beer bottles on the table, the general disarray. How are you holding up? Carlos shrugged, sinking into the chair across from him. I don't know, he admitted, his voice flat. It felt good at first, seeing her face when she realized what was happening. But now, I'm not sure anymore. Jeff nodded, understanding. It's natural to feel conflicted, he said. You were hurt, and you wanted to hurt her back. But revenge, it's a double-edged sword. It might feel good in the moment, but it leaves wounds that don't heal easily. Carlos sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. I thought it would make me feel better, that seeing her suffer would make it all worth it. But now, I just feel empty. Jeff leaned forward, his tone gentle but firm. That's because what you did didn't fix anything, Carlos. It just added more pain on top of the pain that was already there. Carlos looked up, meeting Jeff's eyes. So what now? He asked, his voice tinged with despair. I can't take it back. The whole world knows what she did. But now, they also know what I did. How do I move on from this? Jeff was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. You've got to find a way to forgive yourself, he said finally. Not just for what you did to her, but for how you let it eat you up inside. You need to let go, Carlos, or this will destroy you. Carlos nodded, though he wasn't sure he believed it. The anger, the betrayal, they were still there, gnawing at him. But so was the guilt, the regret for what he had become in the process of getting his revenge. I just wanted to make her pay, he whispered, more to himself than to Jeff. I didn't think about what it would do to me. Jeff stood up, placing a hand on Carlos's shoulder. It's not too late to start healing, he said. But you have to want it. You have to make the choice to move forward. Carlos watched as Jeff walked to the door, the weight of his words sinking in. Thanks, Jeff, he said quietly. For everything. Jeff gave him a small nod. Take care of yourself, Carlos. Don't let this define you. When the door closed behind him, Carlos was left alone once more. He stared out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. The world had moved on, but he was still stuck, trapped in the moment he had set in motion. The victory he had sought, the satisfaction he had craved, had turned to ashes in his mouth. All that was left now was the long road ahead, a road that he would have to walk alone, picking up the pieces of the life he had shattered. Carlos had been slowly coming to terms with his new reality. The thrill of revenge had long since faded, leaving him with a hollow sense of victory. He spent his days going through the motions, trying to rebuild a life that had been shattered beyond recognition. It was during one of these uneventful afternoons that the doorbell rang. At first, Carlos didn't think much of it. He wasn't expecting anyone, and visitors had been rare since the scandal broke. But when he opened the door, he was greeted by a sight that nearly made his blood boil. Harris, the man who had ruined everything. Carlos's hand clenched the doorframe, the anger he'd been suppressing flaring up in an instant. What the hell are you doing here? He demanded, his voice laced with barely contained fury. Harris looked nothing like the arrogant man Carlos remembered. His clothes were disheveled, and dark circles framed his eyes. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by an air of defeat. He seemed to shrink under Carlos's glare, his gaze dropping to the ground. I didn't come to fight, Harris said quietly, his voice lacking its usual bravado. "I came to apologize." Carlos was taken aback by the words. He had expected Harris to come in anger, or maybe even in denial, but not this. "Apologize?" he repeated, his tone incredulous. "After everything you've done, you think you can just apologize and make it all better?" Harris winced at the harshness in Carlos's voice, but he didn't back down. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," he admitted, his eyes meeting Carlos's with a sincerity that was hard to ignore. "But I've lost everything too, Carlos. My job, my family, my friends, they all saw what happened. I'm a pariah now, just like Erica." For a moment, Carlos just stood there, staring at the man in front of him. The rage that had been his constant companion since discovering the affair suddenly felt distant, overshadowed by something else. Pity. He had never imagined Harris, the man who had taken so much from him, could be brought so low. "You think that makes us even?" Carlos asked, though the edge in his voice had softened. "You think losing everything means we're on the same level now?" Harris shook his head, the defeat in his posture becoming more pronounced. "No," he said simply. "I don't think that at all. I just wanted you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. Not just for the affair, but for the way it all ended. For how it hurt you." Carlos felt his anger ebbing away, leaving behind a strange sense of emptiness. He had imagined confronting Harris countless times, rehearsing what he would say, how he would tear into him. But now that the moment was here, all those plans felt pointless. "You've got some nerve coming here," Carlos finally said, though his voice lacked the venom it had held earlier. "But I'll give you this, you've got more guts than I thought. Apologizing can't fix what you've done, but it's a start." Harris nodded, his shoulders slumping in relief. "I'm not asking for anything more," he said. "Just, I needed to say it. I needed you to know that I regret everything. It wasn't worth it. None of it was. I destroyed my own life in the process, and I can never make that right." The two men stood in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air between them. Carlos's mind raced, trying to process everything that had just happened. The anger, the betrayal. It was all still there, but something had shifted. For the first time, he saw Harris not as the villain of his story, but as a man who had made a terrible mistake and was now paying the price. "So, what now?" Carlos asked, his tone less accusatory and more curious. "What do you expect to happen after this?" Harris shrugged, his expression resigned. "I don't know," he admitted. "I don't expect anything from you, Carlos. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, and that I'm going to try to make things right in my own life, even if it's too late for that." Carlos watched as Harris turned to leave, a part of him wanting to stop him, to say more, but the words didn't come. Instead, he simply nodded. "Apology accepted," he said, though the words felt strange on his tongue. He wasn't sure if he truly meant them, but they were a step forward, a way to start moving past the bitterness that had consumed him for so long. As Harris walked away, Carlos felt an unexpected sense of closure settling over him. The revenge had been brutal, and it had brought him some measure of satisfaction in the moment, but it had also left him hollow. Now, with Harris's apology hanging in the air, he felt a small but significant shift within himself. The hatred that had fueled his every action since discovering the affair was beginning to fade, replaced by something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps understanding, perhaps acceptance. Carlos closed the door and leaned against it, his mind racing with everything that had just happened. The visit from Harris had been the last thing he expected, but it had forced him to confront feelings he had been trying to ignore. Revenge had been his driving force, but now he was faced with the reality of what it had cost him. He had won the battle, but the victory had come at a price he hadn't fully understood until now. He walked over to the window, staring out at the city below. The world had moved on, the scandal fading from the public's memory as new stories took its place. But for Carlos, the fallout was still very real. He had lost his wife, his sense of trust, and a part of himself in the process. But maybe, just maybe, this unexpected twist, the apology from the man who had wronged him, could be the beginning of something new, a way to finally let go of the anger and start healing. As the sun set on the horizon, Carlos took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, He felt like he might be ready to walk it.